Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Michael Colgrass.
Good evening. Winds of Nagual is about the study of sorcery. When Carlos Castaneda, who became a writer, was not a writer at the time, he was a student at UCLA, wanted to study hallucinogenic plants, and he asked a friend to introduce him to someone, and he introduced him to someone called Don Juan, who was a shaman, a pre-Columbian shaman living in Mexico, somewhere, probably in his 60s. Carlos is somewhere in his 20s, and he doesn't know that Juan is a shaman, and doesn't realize that he's going to be put into a grueling 13 years of sorcery training. So the books that fascinated me were Tales of Power and Journey to Ixtlan. And this is the first piece I ever wrote that actually is programmatic. That is, it depicts specific things. It's not just an abstract piece of music. You'll see on the screen over here, as the movements go on, you'll see the movement titles and some subtitles of sections in the movements. It opens on the desert with desert birds. I understand that there aren't any desert birds in Sonora, but I like the idea there being birds there, because Juan was always talking about weird birds and crows turning into things. And now, Carlos Castaneda is a realist. If it can't be touched, it doesn't exist. And Juan laughs at him and thinks he needs to learn more about the unconscious and the mystical. So that's the conflict between the two men, and which is so wonderful. In the very first conversation, you'll hear the clarinet play the theme that is Carlos Castaneda's theme. Dim 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 digga dim bim 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 bim. It's a naive and simple little theme, and that represents in my mind his walking up to Juan and saying, "Hello, could I talk to you?" when they meet in a gas station. But as the piece goes on, every movement is a variation on that melody, that little tune, until you hear it maturing as it goes on. He stares at the river, for example, and Juan says, "Stare at the river, look at that bubble, and enter the bubble and travel with it." It's a lesson in hypnosis. Introducing Carlos to his alternate mind. The Gate of Power, where you go out in the desert at night and run through between cactuses without being able to see them. And while doing this, meanwhile, Juan is feeding him peyote and Jimson weed, so Carlos is stoned half the time. And Juan's goal is to teach him to an alternate state of mind through weed of one kind or another, and then how to get that, achieve that state of mind with your consciousness. So in the desert chase, he has the hallucination of seeing he's being chased by a giant fruit fly. You ever seen a fruit fly? It's the ugliest thing. It has inspired many illustrators in Hollywood to create weird, scary beings. And he's chased by this, and Juan screams at him while he's being chased, "Turn around and exert your will, exert your will." And he finally does. You hear his theme, the deep, 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 beep, deep, beep, 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 beep. It's a big heroic dee, 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 da, dee, 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 in the brass. So you're watching Carlos develop as time goes on. Early in the piece, Juan introduces Carlos to another sorcerer, Don Gennaro, and Don Gennaro just thinks that Carlos, with his realistic and naive attitude, is a hoot. And so he teases him, does things like standing on his head and spinning on his head like this. And Carlos is stunned by this, and Gennaro will jump behind a big rock and fart, and the earth shakes, and Carlos is terrified, and Juan and Gennaro break up laughing, and you'll hear the laughter in the orchestra. Not the musicians laughing, that is, you hear it in the instruments. And then there's a meditation movement where he takes Carlos into the mountains and says, "Walk around here until you find your place of power." And typical of Carlos, he says, "What are you talking about? What's this ridiculousness?" So he walks around, he feels warmer and warmer and warmer, and he sits down where it's warm. And he says, "Now meditate. Here you're going to, I want you to, this is where you're going to come to die. Wherever you die, your soul is going to come here. And this is where you'll review your victories in life and your losses, and death will stand at your shoulder, waiting patiently. And when you're finished, death will point to the south." Finally, Juan clowns for Carlos because he's about to say goodbye to him after 13 years of study, and by now, Carlos loves Juan, and it doesn't want to part with him. He says, "What do you mean?" Juan says, "I'm going to leave you now because you now know what I wanted to teach you." And so he and Pablo and Nestor, two other sorcerers' apprentices, go on a march up a mountain to the top of a cliff, and he says, "Now I want you to, this is your final test." He's always testing him. "Leap into the abyss off the edge of the cliff, and after that you'll never see me again." And so he and Pablo and Nestor make 3 leaps. You hear the leaps, and explodes into 1,000 views of the world, as Carlos describes it in his books. So I'll turn the events over now to the master sorcerer here, Eric Wilson, and his apprentices.